Part of these alcohol parties. So the investigation.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Marty Link here with the Department of Health. See, I just want to remind everybody, please have your mics on mute. Callie, I will go ahead and monitor the lobby here, and if anybody comes in, I will add them. We do have this meeting recorded, and Callie, I'll let you introduce yourself, and if you wanted to go over the items of the day, that would be wonderful.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time out today to attend and listen in. I'm the Audit and Internal Control Manager for the Department of Health in the Finance Office. And I am going to go through the PowerPoint that you should have received when you received your subrecipient agreement, what to expect when you're a subrecipient. There is a lot of things tied to federal funding, things that is required of both the Department of Health. When we pass through those funds, they're required of you as well. And it is a requirement placed on the Department of Health to monitor and ensure all of the rules and regulations with spending federal funds happens. So it's a little bit more burden and a little bit more hand holding on the Department of Health's end to have these subrecipient agreements with you. But we certainly appreciate all the work that you do, because without your partnership in this project, we couldn't do the great things that we do for the state. So we certainly want to work with you as a partner and be support you in whatever you need to carry out the activities under these subrecipient agreements. So with that, just what is a subrecipient? Subrecipient is when a recipient, such as the state of South Dakota, receives a federal award, and we pass part of that federal award on to another entity to carry out the objectives of the grant funding. So sometimes a subrecipient receives their own federal grants directly from the federal government, and sometimes they are just a subrecipient of other recipient organizations. In the subrecipient agreement that we provided to you, we listed terms and conditions. Both the state and the federal regulations are listed in there. And when you signed that award, it was agreed upon by all parties that you would follow those regulations. So adequate safeguard of funding. This is just a little depiction of kind of when you receive federal funding, the financial requirements placed on you to keep those funds separate. So the money that we are paying to you on these agreements that we've given you for the regional service designations, it's not state funds that you're receiving, it is federal funds. We did in section 1A1 of your agreement outline the federal award identification number, the assistance listing number, and all of these things will be identification of a federal grant. And so with each assistance listing number and each federal award that you receive, you should keep a separate accounting of all the expenditures, revenues, and obligations or encumbrances, however you identify them in your system, separate from anything else you spend with your own funding or other federal funds. So this would mean you would create a separate general ledger account for each federal fund that you receive, and the revenue and the expenditure should show zero. So everything that you spend under this document, you should bill to the Department of Health. We should reimburse you, and at the end of your grant award, you should have a zero net of your federal grant fund on your general ledger. The unique identifier that you have all had to apply on SAM.gov to have a unique entity identifier, and this is a requirement to receive federal funds. If any of you received a sub-award for 30,000 or more, the Department of Health is typically responsible for putting those out on the Federal Transparency website. But since the Department of Health didn't receive these funds directly, those grant awards are not out there. So let's talk a little bit in depth about what records need to be maintained for these federal funds. So all of you should have and maintain a copy of your subrecipient agreement that you received from the Department of Health. And if you don't have a copy on file or you misplaced your copy, you can always go to opensd.gov and look up your agreement and pull a copy down. So we should have them all scanned out there for public record. You will need to keep source documentation for all of your expenditures, all of your obligations, contracts, purchase orders. Anything that you spend with these funds needs to be supported by adequate documentation. So if you are paying staff salaries or a contract, if you are paying for a purchase order, buying goods, supplies, anything like that, it needs to be adequately documented with source documentation. So if you have payroll expenses, you should have a time card for each employee that's coding time to these grant funds. It should track 100% of their time. So maybe they're only working 2 or 3 hours a day on the regional service designation grant. So those 2 or 3 hours might be noted to the regional service designation grant. The rest of their time is split maybe between other activities within the program. But their time card should reflect 100% of their time and show the amount that they spend just on this grant fund. Expenditures for any supplies or other purchase orders, costs for equipment, anything like that should have a purchase order approved through whatever your approval policy is in your procurement policy for your agency. So it might look a little different between the different subrecipients, but all of you are required to have a procurement policy for receiving federal funds. So whatever your policy is, you should have the adequate documentation showing that the steps to put the purchase order were in place, that you received the goods, you showed receipt of the goods, and you received an invoice. The invoice matched the purchase order and what you were given. And then copies of all that should be included with the invoice that you send to the Department of Health. If you have trainings or you're contracting with an individual to perform some trainings, or you have individuals attending trainings, things are going to look a little bit different. If you do contract with someone to provide training, we should receive a copy of the contract and any of the documentation, their invoice, and any other applicable documentation that you paid out to that contractor to do their training. If you have staff attending training, they're probably going to have a conference registration. You should include that conference registration receipt along with the agenda. If they have travel expenditures, they need to be in accordance with your entity's travel policy. So due to receiving federal funds, you should have a travel policy within your organization that outlines what employees are going to be reimbursed for, whether they get per diem or whether they'll submit actual receipts for their travel. You'll also need to outline what is allowable and unallowable on their travel. So if they can claim meals, lodging, rental car, incidentals, those are all allowable activities under the travel allowance by the federal government requirements. One of the big things I want to point out is there are some unallowable things that can be associated with travel. If you have airline tickets, make sure you have a boarding pass. That if there's electronic boarding passes, maybe just a little statement that said electronic boarding passes were used and have the employee sign it. And if there is actual receipts submitted for reimbursement of meals for your travel costs, they must be detailed. So we need to be able to see what was purchased. If you go to McDonald's, I want to see, a hamburger, fries, and a soft drink. I don't want just, we can't just have a receipt that says McDonald's $10. As really especially important if it is a sit-down restaurant where there might be alcoholic beverages served, as alcohol is not a reimbursable under any federal grant. We cannot reimburse the cost of alcohol with a meal. So we could reimburse the meal. If there is an adult beverage on there, that would have to be taken off or paid for separately, and then just submit the receipt for the meal. Any of the activity that you have with your grant should be kept in a grant file and maintained for a minimum of 3 years. So you'll want to keep your financial records in your accounting system and all your supporting documentation and anything associated with these federal funds for 3 years. Acceptable invoices for reimbursement will include an invoice date, the DOH assigned subrecipient number, the time period covered by the invoice. So if this invoice is for March, I would expect to see March 1st through March 31st. The submission by original invoice or on your letterhead, and we did provide a sample invoice, and the subrecipient attestation must be included and the invoice must be signed. After these agreements went out originally, many of them, the federal regulations updated effective October 1st. So we do have a new subrecipient attestation, and that has been updated on the invoice template that the Department of Health provided. The invoice must be auditable, clear, and detailed. And I just want to add here under the audible, clear, and detailed, I don't know if many of you are aware of the environment at the federal level with federal funds, but there is some new activity regarding COVID funds and the federal funding agencies and some restructures and reorgs that's led to changes in funding and oversight of funding. While this state and local fiscal relief funds that fund these regional service designation grants, that has already come to the state in the form of a cash payment. So the state already has the funding to fund your subrecipient agreements, and there's not a risk of these subrecipient agreements being ended or terminated early at this point in time. Of course, the situation is fluid, but we have received notice that there will be extra scrutiny by the U.S. Treasury over the obligation of the funds and the use of the funds. So when we say invoices must be auditable, clear, and detailed, any information that we can provide to the federal granting agency or to an auditor from the Department of Legislative Audit that shows that these funds were used in accordance with the program as outlined just really protects the state and your entity from any issues we would have with deviating from the intended purpose of the federal funds. This is the sample invoice that was provided to you. Again, we did update that attestation to the new required attestation in the uniform guidance that began October 1st, 2024. If you do use a standard invoice template from your system or your entity, I would just ask that it does include all of these data elements. So it should have your name, address, the agreement number that you are asking for reimbursement on, the period covered by your invoice. It should be dated and numbered. should have a breakdown of expenses by category similar to that, or provide the detail that is applicable to the agreement that you're being reimbursed. That subrecipient attestation must be on there with the proper language, and it must be signed. If you do have any instances where you are going to pass the information, pass any of this funding on to a third party, whether it be a contractor or a subrecipient, you will have to receive written approval from the Department of Health prior to entering into that agreement with a third party. So that's when you will reach out to Marty and Julie and let them know what you're intending to do, why you're intending to do it. I will also ask, I would ask your entity to perform the subrecipient versus contractor determination and submit that with your request to pass the money on, whether that is a contract or a subrecipient. There are additional requirements if we have a subrecipient such as yourself pass part of that scope and funding on to a subrecipient, because it creates a subrecipient of a subrecipient relationship. You would be responsible for doing your own risk assessments, monitoring, and then we would have to monitor your monitoring. So it does add that extra level of risk to both parties with entering into a subrecipient agreement with another subrecipient agreement. And that's why we ask for that determination up front, so we can have that to make our decision whether we approve or disapprove of your passing the funds through.
With the other ones? Okay.
All right, touching back on the documentation for coding time to these funds. So if you are reimbursing employee staff time with these funds, the correct documentation is required. Time cards are an absolute must. Time and effort reporting on federal grants is one of the biggest audit findings across all federal funding. So time cards should be kept. They should be accurately reflect the employee's time with the employee signature and a managerial authorization and signed approval. We do have a sample time card here up on the screen. I did provide Julie with a template, an Excel version, time and effort reporting card. If you don't have one in your agency and are needing one, please reach out to Julie. We want to make sure that all of the time that is being reimbursed with these funds is accurately supported with documentation and the employee and supervisor approval. You can see here on this time form that this employee works on multiple activities throughout the day, throughout their 2-week period, and they code their time to where they actually work. Even if you have a salaried employee, you still need to track their actual hours worked on the grant.
Kelly,
They're still good. Yes.
there is a question in the chat. What if we are the manager / owner? Who do we have sign the timesheet?
If there isn't a board or oversight of any kind, then you would probably have, I would say if you have an office manager or anybody else that can attest to the information and verify it, that would be my next request or next suggestion. Okay, if there's only 2 of you and the co-owners, then both signatures. that you have attested to it. One of the requirements of federal funding is segregation of duties, segregation of payable and receivable, billing, receiving. When you don't have those things, then you need to have a policy in place to really protect any errors from happening. How are those double checks written into your system? Do you have an outside accounting firm that's running your payroll? How can they get into the process of verifying time, hours, and things are done available and appropriate information is provided with your billings? So this is where your policies around spending your funds are going to come into play, because you need to demonstrate those segregation of duties and that you have checks and balances in place to make sure that data is accurate. And that's really common amongst federal grants, is having those conflict of interest policies, having your written policies that demonstrate accountability for taxpayer dollars, and what steps you take to protect them, ensure that they are spent in accordance with the rules and regulations of the federal grant funding and the terms and conditions of the award that you received. So whatever in your organization, whatever allows you to be able to meet those needs should be in writing and disclosed and available in an audit. So the entity must have a time and effort written policy. And that's just what I was saying. Your written policy needs to address, your segregation of duties and how your entity handles timekeeping. You need to record the actual hours worked for each federal and non-federal project in your organization that an employee works. The employee should sign, the employee's supervisor should sign. Electronic timesheets are allowed when the entity has established a written policy recorded by the electronic timekeeping system. So this state uses an electronic timekeeping system. And when I sign my timesheet, I go in and I click a box and I affirm and I attest to the electronic signature, and it signs it for me. So the state has a policy on allowing electronic signatures. They have the ability to track that it was signed electronically and that I attested to the information being true and correct. Some of you will receive a desk review and maybe even an on-site review in the next year or two. That subrecipient monitoring is a requirement placed on the Department of Health due to sub-awarding out these federal grant funds. We use a combination of risk. You all filled out an information sheet that allowed us to determine your level of risk with compliance with the grant funds. We also base that on the amount of money that you receive, your risk, and any past performance. Some of you receive grant funding from the Department of Health or other state agencies in some other capacity. And so we do have prior information that we use when we determine who we will do our monitoring with. So some of the things that we will look at when we do an on-site review or even just a remote desk review is your internal controls. Are you keeping your data secure? Your procurement, equipment management, and fixed asset inventory. And if you have any subrecipients, we'll review your subrecipient policy and documentation. In the reporting area, we'll look at inaccurate or late financial or performance reports. If you received an advanced drawdown, if you have a cash management policy, and if you're tracking your interest earned, and if you did not meet the audit requirements. In the cost area, we'll look at your allowable and unallowable expenditures. So we typically ask for documentation of your expenditures and we'll make sure that they are supported, that they were okayed, and that they were reasonable for the award. And we will review any time and effort policies and documentation around staff time. So if you are paying staff time with these funds, make sure you have your time and effort policy and make sure that you are tracking and keeping good documentation of the hours worked by your staff. And none of these have program income, so that won't be applicable. This is just a list of the things that the department will do to support you in carrying out your federal grant funding. So we provided this PowerPoint as a tool for really the financial activity that happens around receiving federal grant funds. You've provided your insurance is applicable. We've given you a checklist, invoice checklist guidance to make sure that you're meeting the needs and having everything included with your invoice. We've provided the links to the federal requirements and the guidance. We're certainly here if you need any other assistance outside of what we've given you. We are your technical experts in the area of federal grant funds, and really it's our responsibility to make sure that you follow through with complying with the federal requirements and the state requirements. So anything that the department can do to help you, we would like to do. So do not ever hesitate to ask questions or reach out if you're unsure, because it is really our job to support you in carrying out this federal grant award. And then lastly, when you do finish out your award and you give us a final invoice, there will be a closeout report you'll complete and send in, and we will send you a closeout letter just to let you know that we've received everything. We've received your final invoice. It's been processed and paid, and everything is good, and we are done with the program and the project. Again, ask for additional training if you're unsure. Do not hesitate to ask questions. Julie and Marty are certainly your first points of contact. If it's something they can't handle, they'll get in touch with my office. And here's the last link that we have here is just some links to the federal grant guidance. A lot of these you can just Google them and they will come up for you. And if you have any questions, I will open it up to you to question away.
And Callie, while we're waiting for questions, just letting the group know that we will post this video on our website under the EMS Sustainability Grants. So we'll have this webinar recorded for those that may not have been able to make this one and those that can't make the next one they have coming up. But any questions for Callie?
Callie, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so if we requested and was approved multiple smaller dollar amounts for multiple small projects, and as those projects come to completion, there's leftover money in each one of those smaller awards. Can we move that money into a different part of the project within an approved project? Or is that one of those situations where we'd need to reach out to Marty and get that prior approval to move that money over? Or is it just essentially forfeited?
So within the federal grant requirements, we have the ability to rebudget up to 25% of your base award. So if you received $100,000, that means $25,000 could be moved between your budgeted items without federal grant rebudgeting. I do believe that an email to Marty and Julie would be the best practice in this situation, saying, you know, we budgeted $5,000 to purchase wheelchairs. They came in at $4,000. We're going to move $1,000 over to this other project. I think it's just really good for us to have that documentation so we can make sure that we don't exceed any of those thresholds on the rebudgeting under the 25% allowable.
Yep, that answers the question. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions for Callie? Please feel free to unmute or put it in the chat if you have a question. We'll stand by for a couple more minutes here.
While you are thinking of questions or maybe not, I just will leave this best practice with you. One of the most important things that they ever tell you on a grant webinar is if it wasn't documented, it didn't happen. And there's no such thing as too much documentation. So, you know, always document, save emails, save invoices, save everything, attach it in that grant file and keep it for the 3 years after the final invoice, just to cover your entity. And also the Department of Health really appreciates having that to go back to in case there's something that we didn't receive from you on an invoice that might be helpful in an audit or anytime that this federal funding might be looked at within the next 3 years.
All right, Callie, I'm not hearing any other questions or seeing anything in the chat. So thank you so much for your time. I think the next scheduled webinar is next Monday at 3:30. So again, if you have folks that weren't able to make this one, if they can meet next Mondays, that would be great. Otherwise, we'll make sure we post these on our website as soon as they're processed. So yeah, actually, there may be a few other questions there, Callie, in the chat.
I believe that monthly report goes to you guys. Is that a programmatic report or a financial report?
Julie, do you want to cover that one?
Yes, the monthly reports have been coming to me, and then this is on the status of their project, is what they've been sending a monthly report in on. And so the ones I've been getting have been good. I'll be sending out emails reminding some of those who may have forgot. But once you complete your project, you no longer have to send in those monthly reports.
And Mac, I see you have your hand still up, but you have that message in the chat. Any other questions on your side? Okay, see the hand came down. All right, well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for taking time out this afternoon. You take care and we'll be in touch.